Thank you, Madam Speaker. I appreciate the opportunity, as always, to be here in the House chamber and try to be a voice for the people across this country. The people that I represent, of course, as does the Speaker and my colleagues. We each represent 750,000 people, give or take. But we also try to be a voice for everybody. We try to be a voice for the people who don't have a voice. And the people that I represent and the people across this country that I talk to are sick and tired. They're sick and tired of being put in danger because radical progressive Democrats, radical progressive politicians, radical progressive judges, radical progressive district attorneys, radical progressive NGOs, George Soros, the people funding all these entities, are pushing criminals onto the streets of our country and causing harm to Americans. Americans who have been here for generations, or Americans who came here seeking refuge from, for example, Ukraine. How many of my colleagues come to the floor of the House wearing a blue and yellow ribbon or blue and yellow pin? And they wear it for show. And they wear it to pat themselves on the back. And they wear it to seem like they're the ones with a heart, when other people question whether we should fund endless war. But they wear it to say that they care. But where were they when Irina Zarutska was being brutally stabbed in public transit in North Carolina? Where is the media who were outraged when Daniel Penny, a Marine, stopped a violent offender on a New York subway and then was the one being charged and prosecuted for a crime? Would that Irina Zarutska have had Daniel Penny sitting next to her so that she wouldn't lose her life as a refugee from Ukraine, coming to supposedly the freest and strongest and greatest country on earth, just to be brutally murdered because feel-good radical liberals with their jailbreak, let all the criminals out, open borders, take money from George Soros, DAs and judges putting these criminals on the streets, to have a guy who was a 14-time offender, 14-time offender, sitting behind this beautiful girl and just stabs her to death on a train car. Where is all the wailing and the gnashing of teeth from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle? Where are their blue and yellow ribbons today? All of the sanctimonious preaching sure is silent, because they can't bear to acknowledge that if you don't enforce the law, if you invite criminals from around the world into our country with open borders, if you let criminals on our streets with foolish policies by radical judges and district attorneys, then, as my friend from Louisiana knows, as a former law enforcement officer, our streets are no longer safe, and the American dream is no longer able to be achieved. And the freedom we're supposed to enjoy is not possible without the security you're supposed to have under the rule of law. We use a lot of big words. From the Declaration of Independence all the way through today, we talk about a lot of great words. Equal justice under the law, liberty, rights, freedom. But if you don't have the rule of law, none of it matters. The reason people come to the United States, the reason they flock to our country from around the world, is because of the rule of law. Enforcing our constitutional rights given to us by God, recognized by our founders, defended with the blood of patriots, but enforced under the law. They come here knowing they can invest their capital, build a business, and not have it taken away by the state. They know that they can walk the streets freely, or they think that they can walk the streets freely and not be assaulted. They believe that they can raise a family and grow and develop a community and live the American dream that they've seen play out. So they want to come here. But then when people with their fake ribbons and their feel-good propaganda let criminals on the streets, ignore the rule of law, and walk away from the men and women in blue, as they did in the summer of 2020, when our cities were burning and our law enforcement were being attacked, when they defund the police in Austin, Texas, as the radical city council did there, then real people suffer. Americans get hurt. And the American dream dies. The suspect that I talked about with the brutal stabbing in North Carolina, 34 years old, history of mental illness, long rap sheet, had multiple convictions, armed robbery, felony larceny, breaking and entering, more than 5 years in prison, 14 criminal cases. His own family had warned of his history with schizophrenia. His own sister said, quote, he didn't seem like himself when he was released from prison. Assaulted his sister. And now that guy's roaming the public. His release from this incident was conditioned on a written promise that he would appear for his next hearing, only for him to be charged with murdering this young woman. Why would North Carolina office holders, why would North Carolina politicians, judges, not confine or institutionalize this young man? Because a radical ideology has taken root, particularly in my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, but my colleagues on this side of the aisle are not immune to the belief that you can put criminals on the street and not undermine the American dream. The so-called progressive prosecutor movement advocates for less incarceration and less policing, decarceration, pro-criminal policies that undermine public safety. On January 22nd, 2025, San Antonio Police Department officers responded to calls at a San Antonio apartment complex reporting a suicidal individual who was armed and firing his weapon. When officers arrived, the suspect, Brandon Scott Polis, fired upon the officers, striking one of them in the leg. Polis wound up barricading himself in an hours-long standoff and shot an additional 6 officers before San Antonio PD neutralized the situation. Thankfully, all 7 officers survived. But he was a 46-year-old with a history of erratic behavior. He was charged with DWI and assault. And a few days before the shooting, he had been arrested for 2 charges of injury to an elderly person, 1 charge of assault family violence, causing bodily injury, and 1 charge of driving while intoxicated. The Bexar County Magistrate's Office, Bexar County is where San Antonio is, issued a protective order against Polis with instructions not to contact the family members. 3 days later, and less than 24 hours before the January 22nd shooting of 7 San Antonio cops, Polis violated his protective order by visiting a prohibited residence, threatening to kill himself and shoot at any officer. The Bexar County DA in San Antonio, led by a progressive prosecutor, has imposed criminal leniency initiatives that have not only put law-abiding Americans in danger, but also police officers too. The fact is, we are letting the inmates not just run the asylum, we're letting the inmates run our communities. And then we're inviting other countries under the Biden administration to dump their prisons out into our communities. And the radical progressives who allowed that to happen, supported it, and encouraged it, are now attacking President Trump for daring to undo the damage, to reverse the open borders, to secure them, and then try to remove the dangerous criminals that are walking the streets of the United States because of the radical progressives and their open border policies. I know my friend from Louisiana has a lifetime of service, not just as a congressman, but also in law enforcement. And I wonder if my brother from Louisiana would like to expand upon my thesis that the rule of law is the central element to a strong and prosperous United States, and that when our radical progressive friends undermine it by releasing criminals, leaving our borders open, refusing to enforce the law, handing down light sentences, that it endangers our people and undermines the very American dream that people seek to come achieve when they come to our land. I would yield to my friend from Louisiana.